Hi everyone, we're just gonna start a lecture right now. Today we're gonna be covering recycler view and lazy list, and this is actually one of the most important topics I think because every single app uses this type of structure. So just some announcements. Homework 3 was due yesterday, so you can use 2 slip days, so it'll be due tomorrow. And also to enroll in Student Center, I think currently we have 8 students enrolled, which is honestly more than the number of people who show up to lecture, but just make sure you're enrolled so you're able to get the credit for it. And then just to start covering kind of what a recycler view is, this is a Facebook feed. As you can see, you're able to scroll on it, and a recycler view is essentially just a list of items. So in this case, every single Facebook post would be an item. And then we also have Podbean and we have Venmo, and all of these are examples of recycler views. So before we jump into recycler views, we're actually going to cover list views, and list views is kind of what the industry used to use. And essentially, in a list view, it's a list, and each thing is one cell or a singular piece of data. So if we're looking at eatery with Becker, then one cell would just be scrambled eggs or the Becker omelet bar. And in general, this is how you create a list view. It's not too important that you know the syntax, but just some things I wanted to note is first, your first step of creating a list view is you want to put everything into the list. So if you have a menu of Starbucks coffee, the Tazo tea, you want to put that into a variable called menu list. And then after you have this list, you need an adapter. An adapter essentially just puts all of your content into maybe the view that you want, or in this case, if you just want it to show up vertically, then you want to put it into that list. So basically it pulls content from list and populates the view.
Yeah, so an adapter basically adapts from the information that you give it, and it creates a view out of it. So for example, here you can say we call array adapter on this, which is the context, Android r.layout.simple list item 1. So this is just a layout that Android natively gives. And so it'll take in one text and then display it as a list item. And then menu list is the list of things that we have to display.
Yeah. The specific syntax of it doesn't matter too much. It's more that you know that you need a list of data and then you need an adapter to populate the views. And basically, the reason why we don't use list view as often as before is because it's very slow. And essentially, it requires you to create a new view for every single item in your list. So if you have a list of 100 items, you're going to have to create 100 views. And that's very inefficient because when you're actually scrolling, you're not going to see all 100 views at the same time, right? You might only see 4 of them. So for you to create 100 initially, then there's going to be a lot of lag. And it's very costly for long lists. So it's okay if you want to use it for a short list, but after you get past maybe 10 items, then it's no longer efficient. And it only supports vertical scrolling. So sometimes for Instagram stories, you want to scroll horizontally, you wouldn't be able to use a list view because it doesn't support it. And that kind of jumps into the new industry standard or our solution to all the performance issues, which is recycler view. And it's very similar to a list view, so it can also display a list of items. And similarly, one cell is equal to one piece of data. However, due to the name, it's only the cells that are visible to users are created at runtime. And kind of what this means is that, for example, if a screen can only hold 4 Facebook posts, you're only going to create the 4 different views. And then every single time you want to scroll down and see a new post, it's the same view, the same overall shape, but you're putting new content to it. So what that can mean is a new picture or a new caption, but you're still using the same views. So now for a list of 100, you don't have to create 100 views when you launch the screen. Instead, you only have to create the 4 views, and you can attach the different information to each view. So the hidden cells are rendered as you scroll, and the new views aren't being created, but instead you're recycling the old views and attaching new content to it. So in this case, right now, for eatery, we're always using recycler views just because as we're adding like new cafes, new eateries, this is very important. And we don't want to like obviously generate like all 20 like eatery views at the same time. And this is kind of like how the life cycle works. So you have a dirty view, which essentially like is a view that you've already used, but you want to bind it to like the new content. And so then as you scroll, like these views get their content like removed and then they're binded with new content again. And that's just kind of like the life cycle. Does that all make sense? Does anyone have any questions on RecyclerViews? Okay. So now I'm gonna go through like the elements needed for RecyclerView. Kind of like on the, I guess the dev perspective, a list view is easier to implement just because there's less things to consider. But now for the RecyclerView, we have many elements and also functions that you have to call. So our first thing is that our date, this is like our data. You can still store your data within a list, but now, for example, if you want to have a Facebook post, you treat it more like an object. So you have like your different parameters. So you have like your username, your comments, your profile picture, date posted, reactions, and private. And then within your list, you're gonna have a list of Facebook posts, essentially. And then in terms of layout, within your XML, so you have your like overall layout for the whole screen, but now you also want to create a layout for like one singular cell. So like one singular piece of data. So with Facebook, it'd be like a singular Facebook post. But in this case, this is an example from our app volume, and it's just one singular like article. So in this case, since it's one singular article in your XML, what you have to consider is you just have to put like an image, you have to put your different text views and then also like the shout out text. So that's just like how you create your XML for one singular view. So it's kind of different because now you're not doing the whole screen, you're only doing like part of it, but you still need a whole like new XML file for it. And then once your layout is done for one singular data or like one singular cell, you want to consider how you want to organize like everything in like total, right? So on your screen, you can have like a horizontal, that is definitely like a vertical list. But okay, anyways, you can have a vertical list. I took this photo off somewhere. You can have a vertical list, you can have grid view, you can have staggered view, you can have mixed view. So there are so many options in displaying like, or in how you want to display your list, which is a lot better than just list view, because in that case, you would only be able to do like one direction of vertical scrolling. And typically we only use vertical lists and horizontal lists in this class, but I just wanted to show you like the other options that you have if you want to potentially like do this in the future. There's also, oh yes, in your hack challenge at the end of the semester, you can experiment with these different views. I think my hack challenge actually used grid view because we wanted to display a bunch of notes, and it seemed inefficient to display it in just like a column. But yeah, all of RecyclerViews need a layout manager defined, and it just tells the RecyclerView how to render all the items. And then similar to list view, we also need an adapter. So the RecyclerView requests those views and binds the views to the data by calling methods in the adapter. And these methods I will go through like in the future. But basically, you want to define adapter by extending RecyclerView.adapter. And then you need to create a custom adapter for every RecyclerView. This is because for every RecyclerView, you might have a different layout manager. You also might want to use different views. So there's not just like a centralized like adapter that you can just adopt. You really have to create a custom one. But creating a custom one doesn't take too much time. It's just a couple of very set functions, and you can kind of like be creative within those functions. And then we have a view holder. So view holder is essentially what I was saying about like a blank view. And a RecyclerView will create as many view holders as needed to fill up the visible space. So if your screen can only fit 4 Facebook posts, then you're only going to create 4 view holders, regardless of how many Facebook posts you actually want to display. And then when created, it's blank. It doesn't have any data associated with it. And then after creation, the RecyclerView can bind the view holder to its data. And you also just define a view holder by extending RecyclerView.viewholder. So a lot of these things are like built into Android, so it's not too difficult to actually create the custom adapter. Does anyone have any questions on like the elements that we need for a recycler view? Okay, so now we're gonna go through some important functions in the adapter. So as mentioned before, like you have a view holder and then you also have data, right? So there's a function called onBind view holder, and essentially it calls this method to associate a view holder with its data. So the method will fetch the data from whatever list that you're storing it in and put it to fill the view holder's layout. So in the case of like eatery, it'd be like all the dining hall data, and then you would take that and fill like maybe like your little space that you want to display the dining hall in. And then we also have onCreate view holder. So RecyclerView will call this method to create a new view holder. And the method creates and initializes the view holder and its associated view, but it has no content. So this is really something that is getting called like initially, depending on like your screen size, you will create onCreate view holder and it'll like create a certain amount of views. And then finally, you have get item count. So RecyclerView calls this method to get the size of the data set. Sometimes you can also set like a fixed size. So for example, if I set get item count to be 5, then it will only display 5 items, regardless of how long my list actually is. So that's something that you can do, but typically in industry and within the apps that we build, we just want to display everything within the list, right? So then you would just do like your list.size. And RecyclerView uses to determine whether there are no more items that can be displayed. So after it hits like the last item, then obviously it's not gonna like recycle any more views, right? Like the scrolling will just stop. Does anyone have any questions on the functions within the adapter? And all of this is within the textbook. So if you forget any like syntax or like nitty gritty details, the textbook will definitely have like more detailed steps and also examples that you're able to follow. Okay. So now moving on, we just have an example of an adapter. And basically you can see that there's a class that's like view holder, then there's onCreate view holder. And within this onCreate view holder, there's something called .inflate. And what that does is it actually just inflates whatever like XML format you want. And then it will return the view holder. And then onBind view holder is when you actually put the data within the view. So within our class view holder, we defined some text views. And then within our onBind view holder, we're setting the text views to have the text of something in your list. So for example, it'd be like your book name.text, your text view associated to the book name will now be set to whatever book name it is. And then at the end, you have get item count, which just is equal to dataset.size because you want to display all the books within that like list. Does that all make sense? Is it more clear when you're seeing the code?
Yeah, generally like your onCreate view holder and your get item count probably won't be that complicated. The onCreate view holder looks pretty intimidating right now, but it's just like a lot of syntax, I think, and they'll just probably reuse it when you're doing your own thing. And then the complicated one would be onBind view holder, and that's like when you might have to like figure out what you want to display where, maybe you have to like modify your data slightly or whatever, just to make sure that you're displaying the right things.
Yeah. And sometimes it can get more complex if you're doing like networking and calling from the back end. But for now, like it's pretty straightforward. You're kind of just taking like the position of the whatever item is in the list, right? And you're like indexing it and then just getting the different parameters. Does that all make sense? Okay. So now I'm just gonna switch gears and jump into Jetpack Compose. Why are you
so happy about it?
Because it's so much easier. Okay, so in Jetpack Compose, instead of like having kind of like lazy or instead of having like the adapters, like custom adapters that you have to make, it's actually a lot easier. And instead of calling it RecyclerView, we're just gonna call it lazy lists. So in Jetpack Compose, there are lists. And then with lazy list just means it's like scrollable. So this is the Jetpack Compose version of RecyclerView. And a lazy row is a horizontal scrolling list and a lazy column is a vertical scrolling list. And you're able to actually like stack these within each other. So you can have a lazy row within a lazy column. And it's really like up to you how you want to format it. But this is just a very basic kind Jetpack Compose screen with a bunch of messages. And it's very similar to the recycler view. So like at first glance, you wouldn't be able to tell what it is unless you're like a developer and you're actually looking to the code base. So with the lazy list syntax, essentially in this case, we just have a lazy column, but lazy column just defines that like space as being scrollable. And then in order to add each item, the syntax is literally item. So you have item curly bracket, and then you can just put whatever you want in there. And then we also have items, which if you put items with an integer, then it specifies like, for example, you want to add like 5 items to the list, or you can add like 10, however much you want. And something else is that if you're taking it from like a specific list, like a recycler view, you would just like run a for loop through the list and you do like dot for each, you would create an item. So it can like accomplish the same thing, but now you don't need an adapter. And now within a list, you can also like add whatever you want. Like it's not a set format. You can like, this is like first item, last item, you can just put whatever content you want. And then in general, I just have some tips because sometimes you're going to run into errors with lazy list. At least I did when I first started. The first thing is just to avoid using 0 pixel sized items. Like you should set a default size so that the lazy list can like calculate how many items they can fit within that. So like sometimes you're gonna put like match like parent size or like wrap content, and that can lead to issues just because like it just like doesn't show up properly, I guess. But this is something that you can also like experiment with.
Another thing is like Jetpack Compose calculates kind of like height and width at like build time. And so something that can happen with that is like if something starts out initially empty, the Jetpack Compose will assume that it has like a width or a height of 0. And then if you have 0 pixel size items, then you'll run into a bug with lazy lists. And this is like, I think it's different from how native Android does it because I'm not exactly sure why, but I think Jetpack Compose, the reason why it's so much faster and why people prefer it is because it calculates all these size when it builds. And so you can kind of just like build things really quickly with it and have like multiple layers of like lots of layers of like lazy rows and lazy columns inside of each other.
Yeah. But this tip also kind of applies for native Android because in native Android, for your like XML for that one specific cell, your one specific view, you still need to set a size. So I remember when I first started, I wouldn't set the size, and sometimes my like cells wouldn't exist, or they would like all be like smushed together. So it's very important that you set a size of maybe like 200 dp, so at least you can like see the content and then kind of organize the content within that. So just avoid using 0 pixel sized items in general. And sometimes it's just like the wrap content that can lead to issues, especially if it's blank initially. And then another thing for lazy lists is that avoid nesting components that scroll in the same direction. So I mentioned before that you can nest like these lists, but the issue is if you have maybe like 2 vertical lists within each other, then it confuses Jetpack Compose on how you actually want to scroll. So then it will throw in a legal state exception. So instead, just wrap everything into a lazy list. So basically what that means is instead of having like a lazy column within a lazy column, you can just take out all the items for that like inner lazy column and just put those items into the big lazy column, right? Because your items could be anything. So you can like unwrap as you need. And then also try to avoid putting multiple elements in an item. So sometimes how that would look is if you want to like maybe put like a text above an image and you think that they're grouped together, so you're just gonna like put them in like one cell, but instead the correct like way to do it is just to make it separate items. So it'll still be displayed like together, but in terms of like coding, it won't be like one item. So then, yeah, basically the elements will be unable to be composed like separately, which can lead to complexities. If you only want to show like one item, or if you want to change like the padding of one item, or like one like text above an image. So it's better to just separate all concerns. That's the end of lecture.